I had been a park ranger for just over 6 months when I started noticing the strange things in the forest. My name's Jake, and I was fresh out of college when I got this job at a state park in northern Washington. The park was famous for its old-growth forests, miles of untouched wilderness, and unfortunately the occasional UFO sighting. Of course, I didn't believe in that stuff, at least not back then. The first few months were peaceful. I spent most of my days hiking the trails, checking campsites, and making sure tourists didn't wander off too far into the woods. It was routine, quiet, just the way I liked it. That was until the night I heard something that I couldn't explain. It was a late October evening, and I was patrolling the more remote areas of the park. The air had a chill to it, and the dense canopy of trees blocked most of the moonlight, making the trail in front of me barely visible. The radio on my belt crackled with static, but no calls came in. Most campers had already left for the season, leaving the park eerily silent. I was about to head back to the ranger station when I heard it, a low guttural growl that seemed to echo through the trees. At first, I thought it might be a bear. We had plenty of them in the area, but this was different. The sound was deeper, more, primal. It felt like the forest itself was growling at me. I stood still, scanning the trees with my flashlight, but there was nothing, just the sound of the wind rustling through the branches. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the growling stopped. I radioed it in, but the static made it impossible to communicate clearly. I shrugged it off, assuming it was a freak occurrence. Maybe the wind or some animal I wasn't familiar with. But deep down, it didn't sit right with me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. The next day, I decided to head back to the area where I had heard the noise. It was a long hike, but I figured it was worth checking out. Even if just for peace of mind, I walked the same trail, carefully scanning the ground for tracks or signs of wildlife. About an hour in, I found something. At first, I thought they were bear tracks, large, deep impressions in the soft earth. But as I crouched down to get a closer look, I realized these weren't bear tracks at all. They were larger than any bear print I had ever seen, and they looked human. Well, almost human. The footprints had 5 toes, but they were far too big to belong to a person. Each print was nearly twice the size of my boot. My heart started pounding in my chest. I had heard stories about Bigfoot sightings in the area, but I never took them seriously. Yet here I was, staring at what looked like undeniable proof that something large and very real was out here. I followed the tracks for about a mile, deeper into the woods. They led me to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. Something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of the clearing was a circle of trees, their bark stripped clean, as if something had scraped it off. At the center of the circle was a pile of bones. Animal bones, I thought, though I couldn't be sure. That's when I heard the growl again, this time much closer. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. The growl came again, and this time I didn't wait around to find out what it was. I ran, heart pounding, not stopping until I was back at my truck. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had found. I mentioned it to my supervisor, but he just shrugged it off, saying it was probably a bear. But I knew better. Those footprints, that circle of trees, it wasn't normal. That's when I started doing some research. I dug through old park records, news articles, anything I could find about strange occurrences in the area. And what I found was unsettling. Over the past few decades, there had been numerous reports of UFO sightings in and around the park. People claimed to have seen strange lights in the sky hovering over the forest, only to disappear without a trace. But what really caught my attention were the stories about Bigfoot. People had been reporting sightings of a large, hairy creature in the woods for years, and many of those sightings coincided with UFO activity. It seemed ridiculous, like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. But the more I read, the more it started to make sense. Could there be a connection between Bigfoot and the UFOs? I didn't have any answers, but I knew one thing: I had to find out. A week later, I was back on patrol, this time near the northern edge of the park. It was late in the evening, and the sun was just starting to set, casting an orange glow over the trees. I hadn't seen anything unusual all day, and I was about ready to call it a night when I saw them. Lights. At first, I thought they were headlights from a car or maybe a distant plane, but these lights were different. They were bright, almost too bright to look at directly, and they hovered in the sky completely still. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the lights. They were just above the tree line, moving slowly, almost deliberately. As I watched, they began to pulse, changing colors: red, blue, green, before vanishing altogether. I stood there, stunned, unsure of what I had just witnessed, but deep down, I knew. This was what people had been talking about for years. UFOs. And if the stories were true, then Bigfoot wasn't far behind. The next day, I went back to the spot where I had seen the lights. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe some kind of evidence, maybe just reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind. But what I found was far worse than I could have imagined. The footprints were back, but this time they were fresh. They led me deeper into the woods, further than I had ever been. The trees grew thicker, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I followed the tracks until I came to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. It was tall, at least 8 feet, and covered in thick, matted hair. Its eyes glowed a dull yellow in the fading light, and it stared at me with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. This was Bigfoot. For a moment, neither of us moved. I could feel my heart racing, my palms sweaty, but I couldn't look away. The creature let out a low growl, the same growl I had heard before, and took a step toward me. Instinctively, I backed up, tripping over a root and falling to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, but when I looked up, the creature was gone, vanished into the trees as if it had never been there. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's glowing eyes staring back at me. I knew I had to find out what was going on, and I had to do it fast. The next morning, I went back to the park office and started going through old reports again. This time, I focused on the UFO sightings. I found a pattern. Every time there was a UFO sighting, there was also a Bigfoot sighting in the same area, often within days of each other. It was as if the two were connected, like one couldn't exist without the other. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Was Bigfoot some kind of alien? Or was it being controlled by the UFOs? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. A few days later, I received an anonymous tip. Someone had left a note on my truck windshield telling me to go to a specific location deep in the woods. It was a part of the park that was off limits to visitors, an area that had been closed off for years due to hazardous conditions. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the lead. I packed my gear and headed out early the next morning, making my way to the location marked on the note. When I arrived, I found something I never expected: an old abandoned facility hidden deep within the forest. It looked like some kind of research station, long forgotten and overgrown with vines. The windows were shattered and the door hung off its hinges, creaking in the wind. Inside, I found stacks of old papers and equipment, most of it too damaged to read. But one thing stood out: a series of photographs. They showed a Bigfoot clear as day, along with strange glowing orbs in the sky. There was no doubt now. The government or someone had been studying these creatures for years, and they knew about the connection between Bigfoot and the UFOs. As I was leaving the facility, I heard something behind me. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps. I turned around, and there it was again. Bigfoot. It stood at the edge of the trees, watching me. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and then it charged. I ran as fast as I could, heart pounding, lungs burning. But the creature was fast, much faster than I expected. I could hear it crashing through the trees behind me, getting closer with every step. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I jumped in, slammed the door, and sped off, the creature disappearing into the forest behind me. That night, I sat in my cabin, trying to make sense of everything. The footprints, the lights, the creature, it all pointed to one thing. Bigfoot wasn't just some myth or legend. It was real, and it was connected to the UFOs in ways I couldn't fully understand. I don't know if the creature is an alien itself, or if it's being used by them, but one thing is certain. It's out there, and it's watching. And now it knows that I know. A week later, I received another message, this time over the radio. It was faint, almost drowned out by static, but I could make out one word: help. I grabbed my gear and headed out into the night, back into the forest, back to where it all began. As I walked through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Like and subscribe for more stories like this.